The red dust of Dry Hollow did not float. It hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating curtain, coating the back of the throat with the taste of copper and dried blood. It was the summer of 1871, and the Texas Panhandle was less a place of habitation than a test of endurance. The sun beat down on the wooden boardwalks with a malice that felt personal, turning the sap in the pine planks to sticky amber and baking the earth until it cracked like an old ceramic plate. Clara Whitfield stood by the wheel of the stationary mud wagon that had brought her this far, her hand gripping the handle of her carpetbag until her knuckles turned white. She was 24 years old, though the last 3 weeks of travel had made her feel as though she had lived 3 lifetimes. The driver, a man with a face like tanned leather and teeth stained by tobacco, was already tossing down the mail sacks, paying her no more mind than he would a stray cat. "This is the end of the line, miss," the driver had said 10 minutes ago. Clara had not moved. She looked down at her boots, once polished black leather, now scuffed and coated in the ubiquitous red powder. Inside her pocket, her fingers brushed against the small velvet pouch that held her only real insurance against starvation, a silver ring that had belonged to her mother. Aside from that, she possessed a small Bible with a cracked spine, a sewing kit with 3 needles, and exactly $2.40 in coin. She had come west on a promise, a letter, written in a neat, slanting hand, had promised a position at a schoolhouse and, eventually, a marriage that was sensible, safe, and entirely devoid of passion. That was what she had wanted. Back in Missouri, passion had only brought her shame and the sharp sting of betrayal. She had been engaged once, to a man who spoke of God but acted with the carelessness of a child. The engagement had ended 3 days before the wedding, leaving her with a trousseau she could not use and a reputation that was pitiably fragile. She had fled to Texas not for adventure, but for anonymity. She was a woman who remained a virgin not out of simple innocence, but out of a rigid adherence to principle and a profound, bone-deep fear of being hurt again. But the man who was supposed to meet her was not here. The station master had shrugged when she asked for the name, spitting on the floor and telling her he had never heard of the man. Clara took a breath, inhaling the dry heat. She would not cry. Crying wasted water, and in Dry Hollow, water was clearly a luxury. She straightened her spine, adjusting the high collar of her gray dress. It was too hot for wool, but it was the only respectable traveling clothes she owned. She walked away from the station, moving toward the center of the town. Dry Hollow was built around a square that was little more than a patch of beaten earth where not even weeds dared to grow. On one side stood the saloon, its doors swinging open to release the smell of stale beer. On the other, a general store and a livery stable. But the center of the square was dominated by something that made Clara's steps falter. It was a cage. It was constructed of thick iron bars, welded together with crude efficiency, sitting on a raised wooden platform like a stage for a grotesque play. The sun struck the metal, making it shimmer with heat, and inside the cage sat a man. A crowd had gathered around the structure, perhaps 15 or 20 men, mostly cowhands and drifters, with a few women in faded bonnets lingering at the edges. They were laughing, pointing, and passing a bottle of whiskey between them. The atmosphere was charged with a frantic, ugly energy, the kind of excitement that comes when bored men find something weaker than themselves to torment. Clara should have turned away. A lady from Missouri, a teacher and a midwife in training, had no business spectating at such a display, but her feet carried her forward, drawn by a morbid curiosity she could not suppress. The man in the cage was a Comanche. He sat cross-legged on the scorching wooden floor of the cell, his posture so still he might have been carved from mahogany. He wore buckskin leggings that were dark with grease and dirt, but his chest was bare, exposing skin that was pulled tight over lean, hard muscle. His hair was long, black as a raven's wing, and matted in places, hanging loose around a face that betrayed absolutely nothing. Heavy iron shackles bound his ankles, another set bound his wrists, the chains short enough that he could not stand fully upright even if the cage had been tall enough, which it was not. "Hey, warrior!" a man in a dusty bowler hat shouted. throwing a small stone through the bars. The stone struck the prisoner's shoulder. The Comanche did not flinch. He did not blink. He stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance, far beyond the jeering crowd and the dusty buildings. "Look at him," another man sneered. "They say he gutted a man with a skinning knife just for looking at him wrong. A real monster. This one." Clara moved to the edge of the crowd, clutching her bag to her chest. She felt a wave of nausea, not from the heat, but from the palpable malice radiating from the townsfolk. This was their entertainment. In a place where the wind howled and the work broke backs, cruelty had become a pastime. A tall man with a tin star pinned to his vest stepped up onto the platform. He had a thick mustache that drooped over his mouth and eyes that were constantly darting, scanning the crowd for approval. This was Sheriff Blaine Rourke. He rested his hand on the holster of his gun, a gesture that seemed practiced rather than natural. Now, boys," Rourke bellowed, his voice booming but lacking true authority. "Don't damage the merchandise before the circuit judge gets here. We want him hangable, don't we?" The crowd cheered. Rourke grinned, soaking in the attention. He was a man who fed on the fear and validation of others, a bully given a badge. Standing just behind the sheriff, in the shadow of the cage, was a different kind of man. He was older, perhaps 50, dressed in a suit that was of finer cut than anything else in Dry Hollow. He leaned on a cane, though he did not seem to need it. His eyes were cold, calculating, and fixed on the prisoner not with anger, but with the appraisal of a butcher eyeing a side of beef. This was Silas Trent. Clara did not know his name yet, but she recognized the type. He was the kind of man who owned things: land, water, cattle, and people. "Sheriff," Trent said softly. His voice cut through the noise like a razor. "Ensure he gets no water today." "A thirsty dog breaks faster." Rourke nodded quickly, eager to please. "Of course, Mr. Trent, just as you say." Clara felt a flush of indignation rise in her throat. To deny a man water in this heat was not justice. It was torture. She looked back at the prisoner. The local gossip called him a monster, a savage who killed for sport. But Clara had spent 3 years assisting a country doctor in Missouri before she left. She had learned to look at bodies, to read the stories written in flesh and bone. She stepped closer, ignoring the curious glances of a few men who noticed the stranger in their midst. She narrowed her eyes, focusing on the prisoner. He was indeed terrifying in his silence. But as Clara looked, she began to see details that the shouting men missed. She saw the way his lips were cracked and bleeding, not from violence, but from severe dehydration. She saw the way his chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm, forcing his body to conserve energy. Then, her eyes dropped to his wrists. The iron cuffs were heavy, digging into the skin, but underneath the metal, extending up his forearm, Clara saw a distinct ring of raw, abraded flesh. It was a burn mark, wide and angry. It was not the mark of a shackle. It was the mark of a rope. Clara's mind raced. If the sheriff had arrested him and put him in irons, where did the rope burn come from? It looked as if he had been dragged, or suspended, by a lasso. That was not standard procedure for an arrest. Even out here, that was the mark of a lynching that had been interrupted, or an interrogation that had gone too far. She moved another step closer, until she was only a few feet from the bars. The smell of the cage hit her, a mix of old sweat, iron, and something else. Something wild and organic, like crushed sagebrush and wood smoke. The prisoner shifted slightly. As he turned his head, a lock of heavy black hair fell away from his neck. Clara caught a glimpse of something tied into the strands behind his ear. It was hidden carefully, woven into the darkness of his hair so it would not be seen at a casual glance. It looked like a small, rough piece of leather, carved with symbols she could not read. It was a personal object, a token. If he were the mindless, bloodthirsty savage the sheriff claimed, would he have managed to conceal such a delicate thing through a violent arrest? It suggested a layer of complexity, a secret kept. "You there, miss?" Sheriff Rourke had spotted her. The crowd quieted down, turning to look at the woman in the gray dress. Clara did not retreat. She raised her chin, channeling the strict composure of her mother. "I am merely looking—" "Sheriff, this ain't a sight for a lady," Rourke said. Stepping down from the platform, he looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on the curve of her waist. "You new in town, don't recall seeing you before." "I arrived on the afternoon stage," Clara said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I was expecting to be met—" Silas Trent stepped forward then. He moved with the slow confidence of a predator that knows it has no natural enemies. "Dry Hollow is a hard place for a woman alone," Trent said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly chilling. "Perhaps you should step into the shade. The heat can play tricks on the mind. Makes one see things that aren't there." He was warning her. Clara realized it instantly. He had seen her studying the prisoner. "I'm quite well, thank you," Clara replied. She turned her back on Trent, a dangerous move, and looked once more at the man in the cage. At that moment, the Comanche raised his head. For the first time, he looked directly at her. Clara had expected rage. She had expected the wild, rolling eyes of a trapped animal, or the blank stare of a madman. The townspeople had called him a monster, a killer, a beast. But the eyes that met hers were shocking in their clarity. They were dark, endless pools of obsidian. There was no madness in them. There was no begging. What she saw was a profound, paralyzing pain. It was a physical and spiritual agony so intense that he had been forced to lock it away behind a wall of silence just to keep breathing. He was not staring at her. He was looking through her, as if trying to remember what the world looked like before he was put in a cage. His gaze held hers for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. In that silence, the noise of the crowd faded. Clara saw the rope burns again. She saw the hidden leather in his hair. She saw a man who was holding onto his dignity with the last shreds of his strength. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been frozen by suffering. "He needs water," Clara said aloud. She hadn't meant to speak, but the words slipped out, driven by the instinct to heal that was the core of who she was. The crowd laughed. "Roar," Fork chuckled, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "He don't need water, miss, he needs a rope. And come tomorrow, he'll get one." The prisoner broke eye contact. He looked down at his hands, watching a single drop of sweat run down the chain of his shackles. He touched his thumb to the dry earth of the cage floor, a micro-movement that no one else saw. Clara gripped her carpetbag tighter. The town of Dry Hollow was built on red dust and lies. She could feel it. The sheriff was a performer. The rich man was a snake, and the monster in the cage was the only thing in the square that felt real. She turned away from the cage, her face burning, but not from the sun. She had no money, no fiancé, and no friends in this hellscape. But as she walked toward the boarding house the driver had pointed out, Clara Whitfield knew one thing with absolute certainty. The story everyone was telling about the man in the cage was a lie, and she was terrified that she was the only one who cared to know the truth. The heat inside the makeshift office of the dry goods store was even more oppressive than the sun-baked square outside. Clara Whitfield stood before a battered oak desk, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them before her. She had been summoned here 10 minutes after checking into the boarding house, told that her fiancé was waiting. But the man standing by the window was not the man she had constructed in her mind from 3 years of correspondence. Arthur Penhaligon was shorter than she expected, with a weak chin and eyes that refused to meet hers. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "Arthur," Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I do not understand. You wrote that you had a house. You wrote that the school board was expecting me." Arthur winced, finally looking at her. There was no affection in his gaze, only a frantic sort of guilt. "There is no school board, Clara, and the house, well, the house belongs to Mr. Trent." He gestured to the corner of the room. Silas Trent sat in a high-backed leather chair, smoking a thin cigar. He looked at Clara with the same detached amusement he had shown in the square. Arthur works for me, Trent said, his voice smooth as oil. He is my ledger keeper, and a very obedient one. Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. I do not understand, she repeated, looking from Arthur to Trent. Why bring me all this way? Why the letters? Because of the deed. Clara, Arthur blurted out. Stepping forward, he picked up a piece of paper from the desk and thrust it toward her. Your uncle, the one who died last winter in Santa Fe. He left you a parcel of land, 600 acres at the base of the Caprock. I knew of the inheritance, Clara said slowly, but I was told it was worthless scrubland. It has water, Trent interrupted. A spring that never runs dry, even in a summer like this. I need that water for my cattle. I made Arthur write to you because I knew you would never come west for land, but you might come for a husband. The cruelty of it struck her like a physical blow. The romance, the promises of a safe home, the biblical verses he had quoted in his letters, it had all been a trap to lure her into signing away her birthright. Sign the transfer, Arthur pleaded, his voice thin and pathetic. Mr. Trent will give you a ticket back to Missouri. It is the best way. Clara looked at the paper. Then she looked at Trent. And if I do not sign, the door to the office opened, and Sheriff Rourke stepped in. He filled the doorway, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. Then you have no money, no place to stay, and no protection, Rourke said with a grin that showed his yellowed teeth. It is a dangerous town for a woman alone. Miss Whitfield, accidents happen, people get lost. That is a threat, Clara said, stiffening. That is the law, Rourke corrected, stepping closer until she could smell the whiskey on his breath. Out here, the law is the man who has the gun and the water. Right now, you have neither. Clara looked at Arthur, hoping for some spark of decency. He looked away. I will not sign, Clara said, her voice shaking but distinct. Not today, Trent sighed, tapping ash from his cigar. Let her simmer. Sheriff, the desert night gets cold. She will be more reasonable in the morning. Clara turned and walked out, her legs feeling like lead. She emerged back into the blinding afternoon light of the square, her mind reeling. She was trapped. If she stayed, they would force her. If she tried to walk away into the desert, she would die. She wandered toward the water trough near the livery stable, needing to splash her face. As she bent down, voices drifted from the open window of the sheriff's office, which backed onto the alleyway. Damn fool crowd is getting riled up, a deputy's voice said. They want a hanging before supper. Let 'em, Rourke's voice replied. Trent wants the Indian gone. Dead is dead. But the report, Sheriff, the deputy argued nervously. I saw the body of the water guard, that buck in the cage. They say he used a skinning knife, but the hole in the guard's chest, that was a .44 slug, a bullet. If the circuit judge sees the body's already buried, Rourke snapped. And the Indian has a knife on him. That is all the judge needs to know. Now shut your mouth. Clara froze. The water dripped from her fingers. Forgotten. The Comanche in the cage had not killed the guard. He was a convenient scapegoat, framed to cover up a murder that likely involved Trent's men. Trent was clearing the board, removing the indigenous claim to the land, removing the witness, and now trying to remove her. She looked toward the square. The atmosphere had shifted from lazy cruelty to active menace. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, blood-red shadows across the dust. A group of men had gathered near the blacksmith shop. One of them was coiling a heavy hemp rope. They were not going to wait for a trial. They were going to lynch him tonight. Clara felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. She looked at the cage. The prisoner sat exactly as he had before, staring at the horizon. He was going to die for a crime he did not commit, just as she was being destroyed for a land she had never seen. They were both disposable to men like Silas Trent. A cloud of dust rose on the road leading into town. A black buggy, drawn by 2 weary horses, was making its way toward the square. On the side, in fading gold paint, were the words, Territorial Circuit Court. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the only chance. A slim, jagged chance, but the only one she had. She picked up her skirts and ran toward the cage. The buggy halted in front of the sheriff's office just as the mob began to surge toward the platform. An older man climbed out. He wore a dusty black coat and carried a heavy book under his arm. Judge Amos Halley looked exhausted and irritable. "Sheriff," the judge barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "Why is there a mob gathering in my jurisdiction? I expect a jail, not a circus." Rourke hurried out, looking annoyed. "Just local justice. Judge, we caught the killer. The boys are just eager." "I do not care about eagerness," Judge Halley snapped. "I care about paperwork. Where's the writ? Where's the evidence?" "We don't need paper for a savage," someone in the crowd shouted. "He killed a white man." The crowd roared in agreement. Surging forward, the man with the rope climbed onto the platform. The Comanche did not move, though his muscles tensed, readying for the end. "Stop!" The shout was high and desperate. Clara pushed her way through the wall of sweaty bodies, ignoring the hands that tried to grab her. She scrambled up the wooden steps of the platform and stood between the cage and the man with the rope. "Miss, get down from there," Rourke growled, his hand dropping to his gun. "He is entitled to a trial," Clara shouted, her voice trembling. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor, they mean to murder him to hide the truth." Judge Halley squinted at her. "Who are you, young woman?" "I am Clara Whitfield. I am a citizen, and I am a witness to the lack of due process here." She took a breath, playing the only card she had. "I invoke the Custodial Responsibility Act of 1869. Silence rippled through the crowd. Even the judge looked surprised. It was an obscure piece of legislation meant to clear out overcrowded territorial jails by allowing citizens to take responsibility for non-capital offenders or those awaiting trial, provided they posted bond and assumed full liability. "You cannot be serious," Rourke spat. "He is a killer. He is accused," Clara corrected. "And until he is proven guilty, the law says he can be bonded out. I will post his bail." "With what money?" Trent's voice drifted from the back of the crowd. He was watching with a look of mild curiosity, like a man watching a beetle struggle in a cup. "I have property," Clara said, bluffing with the very inheritance they were trying to steal. "I have the deed to the Whitfield claim. It is worth more than the bond." The judge rubbed his temples. "The law does allow it," Halley muttered. "But miss, you are a single woman. You cannot take custody of a male prisoner. It would be improper, unless there is a familial or marital bond." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the prisoner. He was watching her now, his dark eyes intense and unreadable. He understood that something was happening, something that pivoted around him. "Then I will marry him," Clara said. The crowd erupted in laughter and jeers. Rourke looked at her as if she were insane. "Under the territorial law," Clara continued, her voice rising above the noise, "a civil union for the purpose of transport and rehabilitation is valid. I will take him out of this town. I will ensure he stands trial at the military fort in Santa Fe, away from this mob." Rourke stepped forward, his face red. "I won't allow it. He is my prisoner. He is the court's prisoner," Judge Halley interjected, finding his authority. He disliked Rourke, and he disliked lynch mobs even more. "If she posts the bond and assumes the risk, I can clear this docket and get a hot meal." The judge looked at Trent. "Does the town object?" Silas Trent looked at Clara. He saw the desperation in her eyes. He knew she had no water, no food, and no weapons. If she took the Comanche into the desert, the monster would likely kill her, or the Apaches would, or the sun would finish them both. If Clara died in the desert, the land deed would be lost, and he could claim the spring by adverse possession in 6 months. It was cleaner than murder. "Let her have him," Trent said, smiling coldly. "If she wants to bet a killer, let that be her funeral." The judge looked at Clara. "You understand, miss, that if he escapes, you are liable, and if he harms you, the law cannot protect you once you leave these limits." "I understand," Clara said. She turned to the cage. She walked up to the bars. The smell of him was stronger now, sweat and fear and wildness. "Do you understand?" she whispered to him, not knowing if he spoke English. "I can get you out, but you must not kill me." The Comanche looked at her. Slowly, he rose to his feet. He was tall, taller than Rourke. The chains rattled. He looked at the open gate where the judge was standing with the key. "Does the prisoner agree to the bond?" the judge asked. Bored. The Comanche did not speak. He looked at Clara's face, searching for the lie. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw the ring on her finger. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt. He reached through the bars with his bound hands. He pressed the tip of his index finger into the dry red dust of the platform. Then, he raised that dusty finger and pressed it to the center of his own chest, right over his heart. It was a silent oath, earth and blood. "He agrees," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Unlocking," the judge sighed. 10 minutes later, the sun was bleeding into the horizon. Clara sat on the seat of a buckboard wagon she had rented with her watch, the last thing of value she had besides her mother's ring. The Comanche sat beside her. He was still in chains. Though the judge had given Clara the key to the wrist cuffs, the ankle irons remained. They rode out of Dry Hollow, the red dust swirling around the wheels. Behind them, the sheriff and his men stood on the boardwalk, watching like vultures waiting for a carcass to ripen. Trent raised his cigar in a mocking toast. Clara did not look back. She gripped the reins, her hands shaking uncontrollably now that the adrenaline was fading. She was alone in the vast, emptying landscape with a man the world called a monster. She glanced at him. He was staring straight ahead, his profile sharp against the twilight. He did not look at her. He did not say thank you. But as the town faded into the distance, she saw his shoulders drop, just an inch, as the air of the cage left his lungs. They were free, and they were in terrible danger. The vastness of the Texas Panhandle was a deception. To the untrained eye, it looked empty, a rolling ocean of sagebrush and mesquite under a sky so wide it felt heavy. But as Clara Whitfield guided the rattling buckboard wagon away from Dry Hollow, she realized the land was not empty. It was watching. Every rustle of dry grass, every distant cry of a coyote, felt like an accusation. The silence between her and the man on the bench seat was absolute. Tuba sat with his knees pressed together, his body angled slightly away from her, as if he were trying to occupy the smallest possible space. The iron shackles on his ankles clanked with every jolt of the wagon wheels against the hard-packed earth. The key the judge had given her burned in her pocket, but she had not yet used it to free his wrists. She told herself it was prudence. They were miles from civilization now, and the stories of the Comanche monster still echoed in her mind, despite her public defense of him. The sun began to dip, painting the horizon in bruised purples and bloody oranges. The wind picked up, shifting from a furnace blast to a dry, biting chill that cut through Clara's thin gray dress. Clara glanced at him sideways. He was staring at the horizon, his profile sharp and unmoving. He had not asked for water. Though his lips were parched, he had not asked for the key. He simply endured. Her own internal conflict churned like the dust beneath the wheels. Back in Missouri, her experience with men had been defined by their demand for space, for attention, for submission. Her former fiancé had been a man who filled a room with his voice and his needs. Yet here sat a warrior, a man accused of butchery, who seemed intent on making himself invisible to ensure her comfort. He kept his bound hands low in his lap, hiding the chains. When the wagon lurched and his shoulder brushed hers, he flinched away instantly, a sharp intake of breath his only sound. He was not avoiding her because he was guilty. He was avoiding her because he expected her to strike him. The realization hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. She pulled on the reins, bringing the weary horses to a halt near a cluster of limestone rocks that offered a sliver of shelter against the wind. "We stop here," she said, her voice sounding thin in the immense silence. "The horses need rest." Tuba nodded once but did not move to get down. The ankle chains would make climbing down difficult without help. Clara set the brake and climbed down. She walked to his side of the wagon. "I will help you." She expected resistance. Instead, he simply looked at her, his obsidian eyes scanning her face for a threat. When she offered her hand to steady him, he hesitated for a long moment before taking it. His grip was firm but startlingly gentle, his skin rough like sandpaper. As he stepped down, the chains rattled loudly, a jarring noise that made the horses pin their ears back. They set a meager camp in the lee of the rocks. Clara had purchased a small sack of cornmeal and some dried beef with her last few cents, along with 2 canteens of water. She broke a piece of the hard beef and held it out to him. He took it with a nod. They ate in silence, the only sound the wind hissing through the creosote bushes. "I am Clara," she said, pointing to herself. He stopped chewing and looked at her. He did not respond. "Clara," she repeated, enunciating clearly. He lowered his gaze to the fire she had built from dried roots. He tapped his chest lightly with his bound hands, a ghost of the gesture he had used in the town square. But he said no name. He offered no sound. "Can you speak?" she asked. He looked at his wrists, then at the horizon. He made a gesture near his mouth, a cutting motion, then shook his head. Clara frowned. Was he mute, or had he simply forgotten how to speak the language of men after months in a cage? Or perhaps, she thought with a shudder, he simply chose not to speak to a white woman. The answer had to wait. A sound drifted on the wind, not the coyote, not the rustle of grass. It was the rhythmic thud of hooves, fast hooves. Tuba froze. His head snapped up, his posture shifting instantly from passive endurance to predatory alertness. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the drag of the chains, and extinguished their small fire with a kick of dirt. "What is it?" Clara whispered, panic rising in her throat. He grabbed her arm, not gently this time, but with urgent force, and pulled her behind the limestone slab. He pointed toward the ridge they had just crossed. Silhouetted against the dying light were 3 riders. They were not wearing the uniforms of the cavalry, nor did they ride with the discipline of the sheriff's posse. They rode loose and reckless. These were the self-appointed deputies, hired guns looking for a bounty or just a night of violence. "They want the wagon," Clara realized, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They want the deed." The riders slowed as they spotted the wagon. "Looks like they stopped for a picnic. Boys!" one voice shouted, carried by the wind. It was a rough, slurring voice. "Come out, little lady. We just want to check your papers." Tuba looked at Clara. He held up his bound wrists and looked at her with intense, demanding eyes. He needed his hands. Clara fumbled for the key in her pocket. Her fingers were shaking so badly she dropped it into the dust. A gunshot rang out, the bullet spanging off the rock inches above their heads. Clara gasped, dropping to her knees to search for the key in the twilight gloom. Tuba did not wait. He dropped to the ground beside her, his eyes scanning the dirt. He found the small iron key and pressed it into her hand. He held out his wrists, steady as a stone. Clara jammed the key into the mechanism. Click! The first cuff fell. Click! The second! He was free. For a terrifying second, Clara thought he might run, or worse, turn on her. Instead, Tuba rubbed his wrists for a fraction of a second, then pointed to a narrow fissure in the rocks behind them. "Go," his eyes said. He did not run. He picked up a heavy, jagged piece of limestone and melted into the shadows of the rocks, moving with a silence that defied his size and the chains still on his ankles. Clara scrambled into the fissure, pressing herself against the cold stone. She watched as the 3 men dismounted near the wagon. "Where are you, you red-skinned devil?" the leader shouted, kicking the wagon wheel. "We know you are here." They moved toward the rocks, guns drawn. The violence, when it happened, was not like the stories in the Penny Dreadfuls. It was fast, brutal, and confusing. The first man passed a large boulder. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the rock. Tuba struck not with a knife, not with a gun, but with the flat of the heavy stone he carried. He brought it down on the man's arm, shattering the wrist that held the pistol. The man screamed, dropping the gun. Before the second man could turn, Tuba swung the ankle chain that bound his feet, using his own captivity as a weapon. The heavy iron link swept the man's legs out from under him. As the man fell, Tuba stepped in, delivering a precise, calculated kick to the temple. The man went limp. The third man, the leader, panicked. He fired wildly into the dark. "Show yourself." Tuba did not show himself. He circled. He picked up a handful of red dust and threw it into the wind, blinding the gunman. As the man sputtered and wiped his eyes, Tuba lunged. He tackled the man, driving him into the dirt. Clara covered her mouth to stifle a scream. She expected Tuba to kill him. She expected him to take the man's knife and end it, as the townspeople claimed he would. But Tuba did not strike a killing blow. He pinned the man's arms with his knees, grabbed the man's collar, and slammed his head against the hard earth once, hard enough to knock him unconscious, but not hard enough to crush the skull. Then, silence returned. Tuba stood up, breathing heavily. He looked down at the three groaned, unconscious forms. He kicked their guns away, scattering them into the brush. He did not take their scalps. He did not gloat. He turned to look at the fissure where Clara hid. He held out his hand, palm open, safe. Clara emerged, her legs trembling. She looked at the fallen men, then at Tuba. "You did not kill them," she whispered. He looked at the men with something like pity, then shook his head. He pointed to the wagon. It was too risky to stay. The gunshots would attract others. They worked quickly. The wagon was too slow and conspicuous now. They unhitched the two horses. Tuba found an old saddle in the back of the wagon and threw it on the stronger horse for Clara. He would ride bareback on the other, despite his shackled ankles. They rode deeper into the night, leaving the road and cutting across the rough terrain to lose any trail. The moon rose, bathing the landscape in a spectral silver light. Hours later, they reached a dry wash and arroyo that cut through the earth like a scar. Tuba signaled for them to stop. He slid off his horse and knelt by the ground, tracing something in the dirt with his fingers. Clara dismounted and joined him. "What is it?" He pointed to the ground. In the moonlight, Clara could see distinct tracks, deep ruts. "Wagon wheels," she said, "like ours." Tuba shook his head. He traced the width of the track. It was wider, a heavy freight wagon. Then he pointed to a drag mark, a wide, disturbed strip of earth where something heavy had been pulled. He got up and walked a few yards into the brush. He crouched again, brushing away dirt from a dark stain on the rocks. Clara knelt beside him. It was dried blood, old blood. "This is where the murder happened," she breathed. Tuba looked at her and shook his head vehemently. He pointed to the drag marks, then pointed back toward the direction of the town. Then he mimed a wagon stopping, a body being thrown out, and a gun being fired into the corpse. Clara understood. "The water guard," she said, "the pieces falling into place. He was not killed here. He was killed somewhere else, and Trent's men brought the body here to make it look like—" She looked at Tuba. "Like you did it, because this is near the Comanche trail." The injustice of it burned her. They had not just framed him, they had staged a theater of death. "Hola!" The soft voice came from the top of the arroyo bank. Clara gasped, spinning around. Tuba moved in front of her instantly, placing himself between her and the threat. A young man sat on a horse on the ridge. He wore the dusty clothes of a vaquero, a wide-brimmed sombrero shading his face. He held a rifle, but it was resting across his saddle, not pointed at them. "Easy, warrior," the young man said softly. "I am not with them." He rode down the bank slowly, hands visible. He looked to be about 20, with a face that was handsome but tired. "I am Mateo," he said, looking at Clara. "I saw the dust. I saw you leave town." "Are you working for Trent?" Clara asked, her voice sharp. Mateo spat on the ground. "I work for Trent because my mother needs to eat, but I do not sell my soul to him. I saw what they did to this man in the cage." He looked at Tuba with respect. "They say you are a devil." Amigo, but a devil would have killed those 3 idiots back at the rocks. I watched from the ridge. Tuba relaxed his stance slightly. He seemed to recognize Mateo, or perhaps he recognized the poverty and exhaustion in the boy's eyes, a shared language of the oppressed. You cannot go north, Mateo said. Trent has men watching the pass. You must go through the canyon of the Sleeping Cat. It is rough, but they will not follow you there. Mateo reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small pouch of tobacco and a handful of jerky. He tossed it to Tuba. Vaya con Dios, if Trent asks, I saw nothing but coyotes. As Mateo turned his horse to leave, Tuba made a sound, a low, guttural whistle. Mateo stopped. Tuba touched his forehead, a gesture of gratitude. Mateo nodded and disappeared into the night. They rode until the moon was high and the horses could go no further. They found a small overhang in the canyon wall, protected from the wind. Clara was exhausted. Her hands were blistered from the rains, and her mind was reeling. She sat on her blanket, watching Tuba tend to the horses. He moved with a quiet efficiency, checking their hooves, rubbing them down with dry grass. When he finally sat down across from her, Clara noticed him wincing. He was rubbing his wrists. Let me see, she said. He hesitated, then extended his arm. The skin where the cuffs had been was raw, weeping blood and clear fluid. The metal had ground away the flesh down to the muscle in places. Clara opened her small sewing kit. She didn't have much medicine, but she had a small vial of carbolic acid and clean strips of linen. This will sting, she warned. She poured a drop of water from the canteen onto a cloth to wash the dirt away. He did not flinch. Then she applied the antiseptic. His muscles seized, rock hard, and his jaw clenched until a vein popped in his neck. But he made no sound. As she wrapped the linen around his wrist, her fingers brushed his skin. It was warm, alive. For the first time, she realized how large his hands were, how capable of violence. Yet he sat there letting her minister to him like a child. Why? She asked softly. Why didn't you kill them? You could have. He looked at her. The barrier of language was still there, but the barrier of spirit was thinning. He reached up to his hair. His fingers worked at a knot behind his ear. He pulled out the small piece of leather she had seen in the town square. It was a strip of rawhide, old and worn, carved with burnt symbols, a line of mountains, a winding river, and a specific mark, a circle with a dot in the center. He placed it in her hand. Water, he said. His voice was raspy, unused. It was the first word of English he had spoken to her. Clara looked at the leather. It was a map. The spring, she realized. This is the location of the spring on my land. He pointed to the map, then to himself, then to her. We go here. It was a trust offering. He was giving her the destination, the secret he had kept from the sheriff, even under torture. Clara felt a lump in her throat. She looked at the silver ring on her finger, her mother's ring, the symbol of the family she had lost and the principles she clung to. She twisted it round and round, a nervous habit she had developed when her engagement fell apart. Tuba was watching her hands. He saw the anxiety in the movement. Slowly, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a simple leather thong, a spare tie for his hair. It was nothing of value in the white man's world, but out here it was a tool, a necessity. He held it out to her. Clara hesitated, then took it. She understood. He had seen her twisting the ring, seen her need for an anchor. He was offering her something of his own to hold on to. She tied the leather strip around her wrist, next to the silver ring, the rough leather against the smooth silver. Two worlds colliding in the dark. Thank you, she whispered. Tuba nodded. He lay back against the rock, closing his eyes, though Clara knew he was not sleeping. He was listening to the dark. Clara lay down as well, pulling her thin coat tight. The wind howled outside, but for the first time since she left Missouri, she did not feel entirely alone. They were two strangers, stripped of their names and titles by the unforgiving land, bound together by a shared enemy and a fragile, growing trust. She drifted into sleep with the image of the map in her mind, and the single word he had spoken echoing in her ears. Water. It was not just survival. It was a promise. The journey to the base of the Caprock Escarpment had taken 2 grueling days, but when the landscape finally opened up, it felt less like an arrival and more like a revelation. The red dust that had coated their throats for miles gave way to the shocking, vibrant green of cottonwoods, tucked into a fold of the earth. Protected by the looming shadow of the mesa, lay a valley, and in the center of that valley, bubbling up from the limestone with a sound like music, was the spring. This was the Whitfield claim. This was the inheritance that Silas Trent had tried to steal, the water that made men kill. Clara slid down from the saddle, her legs trembling from exhaustion. The air here was cooler, smelling of wet earth and sage. Tuba did not dismount immediately. He sat on the horse's bare back, his dark eyes scanning the ridgeline, the trees, and the shadows of the canyon. He was a creature of perpetual vigilance, even here, in this pocket of paradise. He expected the world to try and kill them. "We are safe here," Clara whispered, though she said it more to convince herself than him. Tuba looked at her, then slid off the horse. He did not speak, but he began to work. Over the next 3 days, a rhythm established itself between them, a fragile domesticity built on the edge of a knife. They were 2 outcasts constructing a life out of nothing. They used the canvas tarp from the stolen supplies to fashion a lean-to against a concave rock face. Tuba, despite the heavy iron shackles still binding his ankles, moved with a grace that shamed the clumsy movements of the townspeople. He vanished into the brush and returned with jackrabbits, their necks snapped cleanly, or handfuls of wild onions. Clara found her own purpose. She was not a frontier woman by birth, but she was a doctor's daughter. She organized their camp with clinical precision. She boiled the water from the spring, not trusting it until she was sure. She used the last of her carbolic acid to keep Tuba's wrist wounds clean, watching the angry red inflammation slowly recede to pink, healing flesh. She watched him, too, when he thought she was not looking. She saw how he would pause while skinning a rabbit to look at the horizon, his face etched with a longing so deep it looked like physical pain. He was a warrior without a war, a man without a tribe, tethered to a white woman by a promise made in the dust. On the 4th afternoon, the outside world intruded. Clara was washing her dress in the stream, scrubbing the gray wool against a smooth stone, when the sound of creaking wood shattered the peace. Tuba was instantly at her side, his hand gripping her shoulder to pull her down into the tall grass. A wagon, battered and listing to one side, was making its way along the dried creek bed. It was not Trent's men. It was a settler family, a gaunt man driving, a woman clutching a baby, and 2 hollow-eyed children in the back. They looked lost, dehydrated, and terrified. The man spotted the smoke of their small fire. "Hello," he croaked, pulling back on the reins. "We have no water, for the love of God." Clara stood up, her heart racing. "We have water," she called out, her instinct to help overriding her fear. But as she stepped forward, Tuba rose beside her. The reaction was instantaneous. The settler's eyes went wide. He dropped the reins and fumbled for a shotgun resting at his feet. "Indian!" he screamed. "Martha, get down! It's a savage!" The woman in the wagon screamed. The shotgun leveled at Tuba's chest. Tuba did not flinch. He stood like a stone pillar, shielding Clara with his body, ready to take the buckshot meant for her. "No!" Clara threw herself in front of Tuba, spreading her arms wide. "Do not shoot! Put it down!" The settler's hands shook. "Step aside. Miss, he'll kill us all. He's a monster." "He's the only reason I'm alive," Clara shouted, her voice ringing off the canyon walls. "He is under my protection, and if you shoot him, you will have to shoot me first." The silence that followed was heavy with the heat of the afternoon. The settler looked at Clara, a white woman, disheveled but commanding, standing in defense of a Comanche warrior. It was a tableau that violated every rule he knew. Slowly, the man lowered the gun. We just want water, miss." "Then take the water," Clara said, her voice hard. "Take it and go. And if you see anyone on the road, you tell them you saw no one here. That is the price of the water." The family drank like cattle, casting fearful glances at Tuba, who watched them with an expressionless mask. When they finally rattled away, disappearing back toward the main trail, Clara felt her knees give way. She sat down hard in the grass. Tuba crouched beside her. He looked at the direction the wagon had gone, then back at her. "Safe," he said. The word was rough, like gravel grinding together. Clara looked at him in surprise. He tapped his chest. "You, safe." Then he pointed to the gun the settler had held, and then to himself. "No, harm." It was a profound effort. He was trying to tell her that he understood what she had done. She had stood between him and death, just as he had stood between her and the posse. "Water," Clara said, pointing to the stream, reinforcing the word he already knew. Then she pointed to the fire. "Fire." Tuba watched her lips. "Fairy," Clara smiled, a genuine, tired smile. She pointed to herself. "Clara." He hesitated. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Clara." Then he pointed to himself. "Tuba." "Tuba," she repeated. It was the first time she had said his name aloud. It felt heavy and real on her tongue. That night, the wind turned cruel. The temperature in the high desert plummeted after sunset, and the thin air carried a bite that pierced through Clara's worn coat. They had built a fire against the rock face to reflect the heat, but it was not enough. Clara sat wrapped in her blanket, shivering violently. Her teeth chattered, a sound she tried to suppress but could not. Tuba sat on the other side of the fire, feeding small sticks into the flames. He seemed impervious to the cold, or perhaps he simply refused to acknowledge it. He looked at her, seeing the tremors racking her small frame. He stood up and moved around the fire. He did not ask for permission, but he moved slowly, giving her time to object. He sat down next to her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He took his own blanket, a rough, woolen thing he had taken from the wagon, and draped it over her shoulders, over her own blanket. Then he hesitated. The social distance between them was a canyon wider than the one they were hiding in. He was a Comanche male, a prisoner. She was a white woman, a teacher, but the cold did not care about propriety. Clara looked up at him. The firelight danced in his obsidian eyes. She realized suddenly that she wanted him to stay. She wanted the warmth. Yes, but she also wanted the presence of the only person in the world who had not lied to her. "Sit," she whispered. "Please." Tuba settled back down, his shoulder pressing lightly against hers. The warmth was immediate, seeping through the layers of wool. Clara felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of vulnerability. It wasn't just the physical proximity. It was the realization that she was completely in his power, and yet she felt safer with him than she had ever felt with Arthur, her fiancé, or even her own father. But the fear was there, not of him, but of herself, of the expectations of the world, of the fact that she was 24 years old and entirely unlearned in the ways of men. Despite the assumptions people made about a woman traveling alone, "I was supposed to be married," she said quietly, staring into the fire. "Arthur, he wrote me letters. I thought I was coming to a home." Tuba listened, his head tilted. He might not have understood all the words, but he understood the tone of betrayal. "I have never—" Clara paused, her face flushing hot in the darkness. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with a calm, steady gaze that demanded honesty. "Still a virgin, warrior," she warned. The words hung in the air between them, stark and defensive. She explained, her voice trembling. "It is not because I do not understand love. It is because my life was controlled. By my father, by the church, by rules. I was afraid to give myself to anyone because I had nothing else to call my own. I need to trust before I can be—" She didn't know if he understood the complexity of her confession. She was telling him that she was not the experienced, worldly woman the town assumed she was. She was telling him that she was fragile. Tuba looked at her for a long time. He looked at the silver ring on her finger. then at the leather tie she wore on her wrist. He understood what she was saying. She was offering him a truth she had given to no one else. She was drawing a boundary, but she was also inviting him to stand at the edge of it. Slowly, Tuba raised his hand. He did not touch her face or her hair. He placed his large, calloused palm flat against his own chest, directly over his heart. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet night. "Then I'll be your patient forever." The English was broken, the accent thick, but the intent was crystal clear. It was a vow. He was not Arthur. He was not a man who took. He was a man who waited. He was a hunter who knew that the most precious things could not be trapped. They had to come willingly. Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. Tears pricked her eyes. She leaned her head sideways, resting it tentatively against his shoulder. He did not pull away. He did not escalate the moment. He simply sat there, a solid wall of warmth against the cold wind. After a moment, he reached out and took her hand, the one wearing the silver ring, and covered it with his own. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a rhythmic, soothing motion. It was not a kiss. It was not a passionate embrace. But as the fire crackled and the coyotes sang in the distance, Clara felt a thrill that was far more potent than mere lust. It was the thrill of being seen and being safe. The peace of the valley was shattered the next morning. Clara was tending to the snares when a pebble skittered down the canyon wall. She looked up to see Mateo, the young vaquero, scrambling down the rocks. His face was pale beneath his tan, and his horse, tethered at the rim, looked ridden to exhaustion. "You must go," Mateo gasped, stumbling toward them. "Now." Tuba was there in an instant, helping the boy steady himself. "Trent," Mateo spat out, accepting the water skin Clara offered. "He has hired men, not just cowboys. He brought in hunters from Dodge City. Professionals. They are tracking the wagon wheel marks." "They know we are here?" Clara asked, gripping her Bible. "They know you are in the basin," Mateo said, "and the sheriff is with them. They have a warrant for Tuba, dead or alive, mostly dead. And for you, Miss Clara. They say you are a captive. They say they are coming to rescue you, even if they have to shoot through him to do it." "They are coming for the water," Clara said bitterly. "The rescue is a lie." "They will be here by sundown," Mateo warned. "You have to run south, into the Badlands." Clara looked at Tuba. Running south meant starvation. It meant being hunted like animals until they made a mistake. It was not a life. She looked down at the Bible in her hands. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. During the long nights, she had found comfort in the familiar verses, but this morning, as she had nervously thumbed through the pages, she had felt a stiffness in the back cover. "Wait," Clara said. She opened the Bible. With a small knife from the mess kit, she slit the lining of the back cover. A folded piece of parchment slid out, yellowed with age but preserved by the leather binding. "My mother told me to never sell the land," Clara murmured. "She said my father was a fool with money, but the land was special." She unfolded the paper. It was not just a sentimental letter. It was a sworn affidavit, signed by a territorial judge and her uncle, dated 10 years prior. It detailed the survey of the Whitfield claim. Her eyes scanned the legal script, and then she saw it. Said parcel, including the entirety of the subterranean spring and surface rights, which shall remain inalienable from the deed holder. Any transfer of land without explicit, separate notarization of water rights is void. "Trent lied," Clara breathed. "The contract he tried to make me sign. It wouldn't have just taken the land. He knew about this clause. He knew he had to trick me because he couldn't legally buy it without my specific consent to the water." She looked up at Tuba and Mateo. "This paper proves Trent is trying to steal the claim. And if he is stealing the claim, he has a motive to kill the water guard and frame you." Tuba looked at the paper. "Paper talks?" he asked, gesturing to the document. "Yes," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "In my world, paper talks louder than guns. If we can get this to the military fort, to the federal marshal, Trent loses everything. But the fort is past the town, Mateo argued. You have to go back through the danger to get to the safety. Tuba looked at Clara. He saw the fire in her eyes. She was no longer the frightened girl at the stagecoach stop. She was a woman fighting for her home. He stood up and walked to the pile of their belongings. He picked up the heavy iron chain that still connected his ankles. He looked at Clara, then pointed to the hammer and chisel she had used to fix the wagon wheel. He was done running. "Cut," he commanded, pointing to the rivets on the ankle cuffs. Clara understood. He could not fight effectively with the chains. And they were going to fight. Not with an army, but with the truth. "It is a trap," Mateo warned. "Trent will have men on the road." "We will not take the road," Tuba said, struggling with the words but finding them. He looked at Clara with a fierce pride. "We take the high path." He pointed to the sheer face of the mesa. Clara looked at the terrifying climb, then at the man who had promised to be her patient guardian. She looked at the paper that held her future. "We go back," Clara said firmly. "We go back and we take back the truth." She picked up the hammer. "Put your leg on the rock. Tuba, let's get these chains off." As the hammer struck the iron, the sound rang out across the valley like a bell, signaling the end of their retreat and the beginning of their war. The sun was beginning to bleed behind the rim of the canyon when they reached the Narrows. This was the only way out of the basin, a choke point where the limestone walls squeezed together like the jaws of a vise, leaving only a narrow strip of rocky ground alongside the creek bed. Clara rode the mare, her back stiff, the Bible tucked securely inside her coat against her ribs. Tuba walked ahead, leading the horse. He was no longer the shackled prisoner she had driven out of Dry Hollow. The iron cuffs were gone, left in the dust of the valley. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his head turning constantly, reading the wind, the shadows, and the silence. The silence was wrong. It was too deep. The birds that usually chattered in the scrub oak at this hour were gone. The wind, usually whistling through the cracks in the rock, seemed to be holding its breath. Tuba stopped. He raised a hand, signaling Clara to halt. He crouched low, pressing his ear to the canyon wall. Then, he looked back at her. His eyes were hard. Trouble. "They are here," Clara whispered, her hand going to the reassuring weight of the revolver she had taken from the supplies, the one Tuba had taught her how to hold, though she prayed she would never have to fire it. "Stay," Tuba commanded. It was one of the few English words he had mastered perfectly, but it was too late for caution. A shot rang out, cracking through the air like a whip. A puff of dust exploded near Tuba's feet. "End of the line, Miss Whitfield." The voice echoed off the canyon walls, magnified and distorted, but unmistakably the smooth, cultured baritone of Silas Trent. From behind a cluster of boulders 50 yards ahead, figures emerged. Silas Trent sat atop a tall bay horse, looking every inch the Lord of the Plains. Beside him was Sheriff Blaine Rourke, his shotgun resting casually across his saddle horn. Behind them were at least 6 other hard men, dust-coated and grim, holding rifles. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked behind her. 2 more riders had appeared at the bend of the canyon they had just passed, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped. "There is no need for violence," Trent called out, guiding his horse forward a few steps. "We just want the paper, Clara, and we want the Indian. You can walk away. I will even give you a horse to get to Santa Fe." Clara urged her mare forward until she was beside Tuba. She would not hide behind him. Not anymore. "I know about the water rights. Mr. Trent," she shouted, her voice trembling but loud. "I have the affidavit. My uncle never sold you the water. You are stealing it." Trent's face darkened. The pretense of civility evaporated. "That paper is a fiction, my dear, and dead women cannot testify in court." He nodded to Rourke. "Finish it. Get the girl." Rourke barked to the hired guns. "Kill the buck." The canyon exploded into chaos. Tuba did not wait to be shot. In the split second before the rifles cracked, he slapped the rump of Clara's mare hard, sending the horse bolting toward a shallow depression in the rock wall that offered cover. Simultaneously, he dove into the brush, vanishing from sight just as the ground where he had stood was chewed up by bullets. "Don't let him flank us!" Rourke screamed, struggling to control his startled horse. Clara slid from the saddle as her horse scrambled into the alcove. She pressed her back against the cold stone, dust raining down on her as bullets chipped away at the rim of her shelter. She clutched the Bible, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She peered out. The scene was a nightmare of noise and smoke. Trent's men were advancing, firing into the brush where Tuba had disappeared. But Tuba was not in the brush. He appeared suddenly on a ledge 10 feet above the canyon floor, moving like a mountain lion. He did not have a gun. He held the long, heavy coil of rope he had taken from their supplies. With a movement too fast to track, he cast the loop. It settled perfectly over the shoulders of the nearest gunman. Tuba yanked back with the strength of a man who had survived the hell of the iron cage. The gunman was ripped from his saddle, flying backward to land with a bone-jarring thud in the dirt. The man's rifle clattered away. Tuba did not shoot him. He dropped from the ledge, landing beside the stunned man. Before the mercenary could reach for his pistol, Tuba kicked the weapon away and delivered a single, precise blow to the jaw. The man went limp. "He's above us," another man shouted, firing wildly at the rocks. Tuba was already moving. He used the terrain as a weapon, weaving through the boulders, drawing their fire away from Clara. He was a ghost, a shadow. Every time they thought they had a bead on him, he was gone, reappearing to strike a rock thrown with deadly accuracy to smash a hand holding a gun. A sudden rush to spook a horse and send its rider tumbling. He was fighting a war, but he was not fighting as they expected. He was not the bloodthirsty savage of their stories. He was disarming them, disabling them, stripping them of their power without taking their lives. "Stop playing games," Trent roared, his face red with rage. "Mateo, take the flank! Flush the girl out!" Clara froze. "Mateo!" From the side of the creek bed, the young vaquero rode into view. He was leading 3 of Trent's hired guns. He looked straight at Clara's hiding spot. "There!" Mateo shouted, pointing his rifle at her. "She is in the rocks! Follow me!" Clara felt a cold knife of betrayal twist in her gut. Mateo had helped them. Had he sold them out in the end? Mateo spurred his horse, charging not directly at Clara, but toward a patch of smooth, wet sand near the creek edge, the quicksand that formed after the flash floods. "Follow me!" Mateo yelled again, driving his horse to jump the treacherous patch. The 3 hired guns, blind with the lust for the kill, followed him. They did not know the land. They did not see the danger. The first horse hit the mud and sank to its knees instantly, pitching its rider forward into the muck. The second rider tried to swerve, colliding with the third. In seconds, the flank attack turned into a churning, shouting mess of trapped horses and cursing men. Mateo pulled his horse up on the solid ground beyond. He turned, raised his rifle, and fired not at Clara, but into the air. "It is a trap," Mateo shouted, but he was smiling at Clara. He had led them into the mire to save her. "Treason!" Trent screamed. He drew a pearl-handled revolver from his coat. "I will kill you all myself." Sheriff Rourke had had enough. He saw his men faltering, saw the monster dismantling his posse piece by piece. He turned his horse toward Clara's alcove. "Come out, schoolteacher," Rourke bellowed, "or I will burn you out." Clara looked at the chaos. Tuba was pinned down behind a boulder, 3 men firing at him to keep him suppressed. Mateo was reloading, but he was too far away to stop the sheriff. If she stayed hidden, Tuba would die trying to reach her. If she ran, she would be shot. She looked at the Bible in her hand. The truth. Clara stood up. She stepped out from the alcove, into the open. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs. She looked small against the towering walls of the canyon, but she stood straight. "Stop!" she screamed. Her voice was high and clear, cutting through the gunfire. "I have the proof." Clara held the parchment high, waving it like a flag. "This is the affidavit Trent knew the water belonged to the estate. He staged the murder to cover his theft." Rourke laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He leveled his shotgun at her. "You are a foolish woman. Do you think I care about paper? I am the law here. You are a murderer, Clara shouted, her eyes locking onto his. You killed the water guard. Tuba didn't do it. You did it to frame him because he saw you moving the boundary markers. The accusation hung in the air. For a second, the shooting slowed. The hired men looked at Rourke. They were mercenaries, not ideologues. Killing a Comanche was one thing. Being part of a land swindle that involved murdering a white guard was another. She is lying, Rourke yelled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Drop her. Drop your weapon. Sheriff! The command boomed from the canyon entrance behind Trent, deep and authoritative. Everyone froze, riding into the canyon, flanked by 4 uniformed soldiers of the U.S. Cavalry, was Judge Amos Halley. Beside him rode a man with a silver badge on his chest, a U.S. Marshal. Mateo had not just warned them to run. He had sent a telegram from the station before he left. He had brought the federal law. Judge, Trent shouted, his face draining of color. Thank God you are here, this woman. She has gone mad. She is armed and dangerous. Silence, Judge Halley roared. He rode forward, his eyes blazing. I received a very interesting message from young Mateo here, and I have been listening to this mad woman screaming about an affidavit. The judge looked at Rourke. Lower your weapon. Sheriff, now. Rourke hesitated. His eyes darted around like a trapped rat. He looked at Trent, but Trent was already distancing himself, sitting stiffly on his horse, looking straight ahead. Rourke realized he was the scapegoat. The rage boiled over. I am the law, Rourke screamed. He swung the shotgun back toward Clara. Bang! The shot did not come from Rourke. A rock, the size of a fist, struck Rourke's wrist with the force of a cannonball. The shotgun discharged into the dirt as Rourke howled in pain, dropping the weapon. Tuba stood on the rock above Clara, his chest heaving, his arm still extended from the throw. He leaped down, landing between Clara and the sheriff. Rourke scrambled for his sidearm with his left hand. Clara moved. She stepped past Tuba. She raised her own heavy revolver, the one she had prayed not to use. She cocked the hammer. The click was loud in the sudden silence. She aimed it directly at Rourke's chest. Do not move, she said. Her voice was ice cold. Rourke froze. He looked into Clara's eyes and saw no hesitation. He saw the daughter of a pioneer, a woman who had survived the desert and the scorn of men. Go on, Rourke sneered, blood dripping from his shattered wrist. Shoot me. Show them you are just as wild as him. Clara's finger trembled on the trigger. Every fiber of her being wanted to pull it. For the fear he had caused. For the cage. For the water guard. For Tuba's scars. It would be justice. It would be clean. She felt Tuba's presence behind her. He was not touching her, but she could feel his heat. He was waiting. He was watching to see what kind of creature she was. If she killed Rourke now, unarmed and wounded, she became them. She became Trent. She became the law of the gun. Clara took a breath. She slowly lowered the barrel of the gun until it pointed at Rourke's knees. I am not you, she said softly. She looked up at the judge. Marshal, arrest this man. The U.S. Marshal rode forward, dismounting to kick Rourke's gun away and slap irons onto his wrists. 2 soldiers moved to surround Trent, pulling him from his horse. This is an outrage, Trent sputtered. I demand to see my lawyer. You will see the inside of a federal cell, Judge Halley said dryly, and I will enjoy reading that affidavit, Miss Whitfield. The canyon floor was quiet now. Save for the groans of the men Tuba had knocked out, the dust began to settle. The townspeople who had followed the posse, curious onlookers who had stayed back at the canyon mouth, began to filter in. They stared at the scene. They saw the wealthy Silas Trent in custody. They saw their sheriff in handcuffs. And they saw the monster. Tuba stood beside Clara. He was bruised, bleeding from a scratch on his cheek, and covered in red dust. But he stood tall. He was not cowering. He was not raging. Judge Halley rode closer. He looked at Tuba. Sheriff Rourke claims you killed the water guard with a knife, the judge said, his voice neutral. He claims you are a mute animal incapable of reason. The crowd watched. This was the moment. The narrative of the savage warrior hung in the balance. Tuba looked at the judge. Then he looked at Rourke, who was glaring at him with pure hate. Finally, he turned his eyes to Clara. He saw the pride in her face. He saw that she had not just saved his life, she had saved his dignity. She had given him a space to exist. Tuba turned back to the judge. He squared his shoulders. He took a breath of the cool canyon air. He lied. The words were short, clipped, and heavily accented, but they were English. They were human. A gasp went through the crowd. The animal spoke. Tuba pointed a long finger at Rourke. "Not monster," Tuba said, his voice gaining depth, resonating off the canyon walls. He touched his own chest. "Man." It was a declaration of existence. It was a shattering of the myth that Dry Hollow had built to justify its cruelty. Judge Halley nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing his face. "I believe you are, sir. I believe you are." Clara felt the tears finally spill over. She holstered her gun and reached out, her hand finding Tuba's arm. He did not pull away. He looked down at her, and the ghost of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. Mateo walked over, leading his horse out of the mud. He grinned at them, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That was a good speech, amigo. Short, but good." The marshal began to organize the prisoners. The threat was broken. The sun was fully down now, casting the canyon in a twilight blue. Clara looked at the spring bubbling nearby. The water was clear, running over the rocks, indifferent to the violence men inflicted on each other for it. "It is over," she whispered. Tuba looked at the water, then at the open road leading back to the town, and beyond that, to the fort where his name would be cleared. "No," Tuba said softly, so only she could hear. "Start." He was right. The survival was over. The living was just beginning. The victory at the canyon was loud, violent, and immediate. But the justice that followed was a slow, grinding machine that smelled of ink, stale tobacco, and unwashed wool. They had traveled to the military outpost at Fort Bascom, crossing the territorial line where the jurisdiction was clearer and the influence of Silas Trent was weaker. The fort was a bleak collection of adobe buildings and timber stockades, sitting under the relentless sun like a blister on the earth. Here, the drama of the shootout faded into the tedium of bureaucracy. Clara Whitfield spent 3 days sitting on a hard wooden bench in the provost marshal's office. The room was stifling, filled with the scratching of pens and the murmuring of clerks who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. To them, she was a scandal, a white woman traveling with a Comanche, a schoolteacher who had held a gun to a sheriff's chest. "State your name for the record," the military clerk said for the 5th time, dipping his pen into the inkwell. "Clara Whitfield," she replied, her voice raspy from the dry air but unyielding. "And the man you are holding in the guardhouse is not a prisoner of war. He is my husband by common law bond, and he is a free man under the protection of the court." The clerk looked up, sneering slightly. "The savage? You mean—" "His name is Tuba," Clara said, leaning forward. "And if you call him a savage again, I will lodge a formal complaint with Judge Halley, who is currently dining with your colonel." The clerk soured but wrote down the name. It was not a heroic process. There were no cheering crowds. Clara had to detail every moment of their journey, every threat made by Trent, every action taken in self-defense. She had to strip her life bare and lay it out on legal paper to be judged by men who had never known a day of hunger or true fear. Tuba was kept separately. They did not put him in a cage, thanks to the judge's orders, but he was confined to a barracks room, watched by 2 armed guards. He was an object of fascination for the soldiers. They came to stare at the monster who had taken down Sheriff Rourke's posse without firing a shot. They expected a raving beast. Instead, they found a man who sat in perfect stillness, staring at the wall, refusing to engage with their taunts. Judge Amos Halley was the only reason they were not thrown out of the fort. The old man seemed to have found a second wind in this case. He relished the chance to dismantle Silas Trent's empire. He moved through the legal proceedings with the precision of a surgeon, filing motions, suppressing Rourke's fraudulent reports, and ensuring that the affidavit from Clara's Bible was entered into the permanent territorial record. On the fourth day, the breakthrough came not from a lawyer, but from a memory. Clara was waiting outside the barracks, hoping to catch a glimpse of Tuba, when an old woman approached her. She was a laundry worker at the fort, her face a map of deep wrinkles, her hair braided with colored yarn. She was indigenous, perhaps Kiowa or Comanche, living on the fringe of the fort's economy. She stopped in front of Clara and looked at the barracks door. "I know him," the woman said. Her English was broken but clear. Clara turned, startled. "You know Tuba?" The woman nodded. "I knew his mother. Long time ago. Before the sickness. Before the soldiers." She looked at Clara with dark, appraising eyes. "They call him Warrior, but that is not his name. His name was Runs with Silence. He was a maker of things. Saddles, shoes. Not a killer." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. "He is a leather worker. I saw his hands. He had a wife," the old woman continued, her voice devoid of sentimentality. "And a daughter. Bluecoats came. Drunken men. Not these soldiers here, but others. Bad men. They killed the wife. They took the girl." Clara put a hand to her mouth. "He fought," the woman said. "He fought like a bear, but there were too many. They beat him. They left him for dead. When he woke up, his family was gone. His voice was gone. He stopped speaking because words did not save them." The revelation hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. Tuba's silence was not just trauma. It was a judgment. He had judged the world unworthy of his voice because the world had taken everything that mattered. And yet, in the canyon, he had spoken. He had spoken to save her. "Will you tell the judge?" Clara asked, gripping the woman's arm. "Will you tell them he is not a monster?" The woman looked at the fort commanders walking across the parade ground. "They will not listen to me. I am just a washerwoman." "They will listen," Clara said fiercely, "because I will make them." And she did. Clara marched the woman into the hearing room. Interrupting a deposition, she forced the tribunal to hear the testimony. It was a small moment, unrecorded in the history books, but it shifted the air in the room. Tuba was no longer a faceless symbol of the Indian threat. He was a widower, a father, a victim. When the gavel finally banged down 2 days later, the verdict was technical but absolute. "Case against the defendant dismissed for lack of evidence," Judge Halley declared, looking over his spectacles at the sullen prosecutor. "The prisoner is to be released immediately. The charges against Sheriff Rourke and Silas Trent for conspiracy and attempted murder will proceed to the grand jury." It was over. But as they walked out of the fort gates, the reception was not warm. A group of settlers, waiting for supplies, spat on the ground as Tuba passed. "Should have hanged him," one man muttered. "Giving them rights now. What is the world coming to?" Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but Tuba did not react. He walked with his head high, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was used to the hate. What was new was the piece of paper in Clara's pocket, a document stamped with the seal of the United States territory, declaring the Whitfield claim, including all water and mineral rights, to be the sole property of Clara Whitfield. And there was another paper, a smaller one, a marriage certificate, hastily drawn up by the fort chaplain to satisfy the custodial responsibility loophole that had gotten them out of Dry Hollow. They camped that night 10 miles from the fort, under the shelter of a grove of mesquite. The air was cool, and the sky was a vast, indifferent canvas of stars. Mateo had ridden with them. The young vaquero had been officially fired by Trent's foreman, but he looked happier than Clara had ever seen him. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. "So," Mateo said, tossing a stick into the flames, "I am a free agent now. No job, no money, and a sheriff who wants to shoot me if he ever gets out of jail." "You have a job," Clara said. She looked at Tuba, who was tending to the horses. "We have land, 600 acres, but we cannot work it alone. We need someone who knows cattle, someone who knows the market." Mateo grinned. "I am expensive." Patrona, we can pay you in land, Clara offered. 10 acres of your own, with water rights. After 1 year, Mateo's smile faded into a look of shock. Land ownership was a dream for a man like him, usually destined to be a hand for the rest of his life. You are serious, dead serious, Clara said. Mateo looked at Tuba. The Comanche nodded once, a sharp, affirmative motion. Then you have a deal, Mateo said. He stood up, stretching. I will take the first watch. You two, you have things to talk about. He walked away into the darkness, leaving them alone. Clara sat by the fire, twisting the silver ring on her finger. The metal felt heavy tonight. It was the ring her mother had given her, the ring that represented a life of safety, of propriety, of doing what was expected. She looked at Tuba. He was sitting on a log, watching her. He was no longer the patient. He was the partner. Clara slowly pulled the ring from her finger. She held it in the firelight for a moment, watching the silver gleam. Then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden matchbox. She placed the ring inside and slid the box shut. She did not throw it away. That would be denying who she was. She simply put it away. It was a memory, not a shackle. She looked at her wrist. Where the leather thong Tuba had given her was still tied. It was rough, weathered, and strong. Tuba, she said softly. He looked at her. The paper from the fort, she began, struggling to find the right words. It says, we are married. In the eyes of the law, you are my husband. That is why they let you go. That is why you are safe. Tuba nodded. Paper shield. Yes, Clara said. A shield. But, she took a breath. I do not want to lie to you. A paper is not a heart. You made a promise to be patient. I am holding you to that. Tuba moved off the log and sat on the ground near her, close enough to touch but respecting the distance. He picked up a stick and drew a circle in the dirt. Inside the circle, he drew 2 lines side by side. Paper is for them, he said, gesturing toward the direction of the fort. He touched his chest. Heart is for here. He looked at her with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch. I learn, he said. I learn words. I learn your world, so I can speak for you, so you do not have to hold the gun. It was a profound offer. He was offering to change, to adapt, to enter the world that had caged him, solely so he could protect her. Clara reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, calloused from years of work and war. And I will teach you, she promised. But we build this slowly, like a house, stone by stone. Stone by stone. Tuba repeated, testing the English sounds. He squeezed her hand gently. They returned to the valley 3 days later. It was different now. It was no longer a hiding place. It was a homestead. The work that followed was grueling. The romance of the West evaporated in the face of the reality of survival. There were fences to be built to keep the few cattle Mateo had managed to round up. There were irrigation ditches to be dug from the spring to the flat land where they hoped to plant corn. Clara's hands, once soft and stained only by ink, became hard and brown. She learned to swing a hammer, to mix mud for the adobe bricks, to shoot a rabbit for the stew pot without flinching. Tuba worked with a terrifying intensity. He built a cabin from the cottonwood timber and stone, constructing it with the precision the old woman had spoken of. He was a craftsman. He made a door that fit so perfectly not a breath of wind could get through. He built a rocking chair for Clara, carving the arms with smooth, flowing lines that mimicked the flow of the water. They fell into a routine that was intimate but chaste. They slept in the same small cabin, Clara in the bed Tuba had built, Tuba on a pallet of furs near the door. He was still the guardian, the warrior at the gate, but the mornings were soft. They would drink coffee together as the sun came up over the mesa, and Clara would teach him 3 new words. Seed, Clara would say, holding up a kernel of corn. Seed, Tuba would repeat. Life inside. Yes, Clara smiled. Life inside. One afternoon, 2 months after their return, a wagon appeared on the horizon. It was not Trent. Trent was awaiting trial in Santa Fe. his empire crumbling as creditors and lawyers picked over the carcass of his business. This wagon was modest, covered in canvas that had seen better days. It halted at the edge of their property, near the new fence line. Clara was in the garden, hoeing rows for the late squash. She stood up, wiping sweat from her forehead. Tuba was on the roof of the cabin, fixing a shingle. He slid down instantly, landing cat-like, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "Wait," Clara said, putting a hand on his arm. "Look." The driver of the wagon was a man who looked terrified. Beside him was a woman who was clearly in distress, clutching her swollen belly. "Please," the man shouted. "My wife, the baby's coming early. The wagon broke an axle on the rocks. We can't move." Clara did not hesitate. The memories of Dry Hollow, of being stranded and ignored, were still fresh. "Bring her inside," Clara shouted, dropping her hoe. "Mateo!" "Help them with the horses." Tuba watched them. He saw the fear in the white man's eyes as he looked at the Comanche standing by the door. Tuba stepped forward. The man flinched. "Safe," Tuba said, his voice deep and calm. He gestured to the door. "Clara, doctor, good hands." The man blinked, surprised by the English and the kindness. "Thank you," he stammered. "Thank you." Tuba did not smile, but he nodded. He went to the broken wagon. He examined the axle. It was snapped clean through. He looked at the man, then pointed to the workshop area where he kept his tools. "I fix," Tuba said. "You, wait." That night, the valley was filled with the sounds of life. The cry of a newborn baby echoed off the canyon walls, a sharp, defiant sound against the silence of the desert. Clara came out of the cabin hours later, exhausted but glowing. She found Tuba sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar. "It is a boy," she said softly, sitting down beside him. "They are both healthy." Tuba stopped whittling. He looked at the cabin, then at Clara. "New life," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "They asked the name of this place. They want to write it in their family Bible, the place where their son was born." Tuba looked around. He looked at the spring, the growing corn, the fence lines, and the stars above. He looked at Clara, the woman who had walked into a cage to save him, and who now sat beside him not as a savior, but as an equal. He thought of the word for home in his own language, but that felt like the past. He thought of the word in English. "Sanctuary," Clara suggested. Tuba shook his head. That was a place for hiding. "Free," Tuba said. Clara smiled. "Free spring?" Tuba nodded. He liked the sound of it. It had the water. It had the liberty. The family stayed for 2 weeks while the woman recovered and Tuba rebuilt their wagon wheel with iron and seasoned wood, making it stronger than it had been when it was new. When they left, they did not leave with stories of a monster. They left with stories of a sanctuary, a woman who healed, and a Comanche warrior who built better wheels than any smith in Texas. Mateo watched them go, leaning against the fence. "You know, Patrona," he said to Clara. "They will talk. Others will come. Good people, bad people, but mostly people who need water." "Let them come," Clara said, watching Tuba test the tension of the fence wire. "We are not afraid anymore." The season turned. The heat of summer broke into the golden light of autumn. The corn grew tall and strong. One evening, Tuba came to Clara with a small box in his hand. It was not a jewelry box from a store. It was made of polished mesquite wood, the grain swirling like water. He had made it. Clara opened it. Inside lay her mother's silver ring. She looked at him, confused. "I put this away, not for past," Tuba said. He took the ring from the box. He took her hand. "For now." He did not put it on her finger. He held it out. "You choose." Tuba said, "Every day, you choose." He was telling her that she was not bound by the paper, or by gratitude, or by fear. She was free to leave. She was free to stay. The ring was no longer a shackle of her mother's expectations. It was a gift of choice from him. Clara looked at the ring, then at the man standing before her, the man who had learned her language. who had built her a home, who had waited with the patience of a mountain. She took the ring. She did not put it on her finger. She put it back in the box and closed the lid. Then she set the box on the table. "I do not need the ring to know where I belong," Clara said. She stepped forward and placed her hands on his chest, over his heart. "I choose you," she whispered. "I choose this." Tuba let out a long breath, and for the first time, he wrapped his arms around her fully, pulling her into the warmth of his body. It was not the desperate cling of survival anymore. It was the solid, enduring embrace of a man holding his world. Outside, the wind blew through the cottonwoods, but inside, the fire was steady, and the silence was no longer empty. It was full. The winter of 1871 finally broke, retreating north toward the Rockies and leaving the Texas panhandle washed in the pale, hopeful light of spring. The wind, which had howled like a banshee through the canyons for months, softened into a breeze that smelled of wet sage and warming earth. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin they had built. It was a sturdy structure now, no longer the drafty shelter of their desperate beginnings. Tuba had added a covered porch, knowing she'd like to watch the sunset. And from the rafters hung a wind chime he had fashioned from old horseshoe nails and flattened bits of tin. It did not sound like the delicate crystal chimes of the parlors back in Missouri. It made a low, melodic, clinking sound, like the heartbeat of the land itself. She wiped her hands on her apron. She had been kneading dough for the evening bread, and her knuckles were dusted with flour. She looked out toward the paddock where Tuba was working with a young colt Mateo had brought in from the wild herd. Clara watched him. He moved with the same fluid power that had terrified the town of Dry Hollow, but the tension was gone from his shoulders. He was no longer a coiled spring waiting to strike. He was a man doing work he understood, on land that miraculously belonged to them. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in a gray wool dress, clutching a Bible and a fear of the world. That Clara was a ghost. The woman standing on the porch wore a dress of durable calico. Her skin was browned by the sun, and her eyes no longer looked for an exit. She had learned that freedom was not about running away. It was about standing still when you wanted to run. Tuba finished with the colt, patting its neck with a heavy, rhythmic hand, and walked toward the cabin. He stopped at the water trough to wash the dust from his arms. When he looked up and saw her watching him, his expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. It was a look of quiet possession, not that he owned her, but that he belonged to her. He walked up the steps, the wood creaking familiarly under his boots. He did not go inside immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his leather vest. "For you," he said. His voice was deeper now, more resonant. As he used it more often, he held out his hand. Sitting in his calloused palm was a necklace. It was a simple strip of braided rawhide, soft as silk from hours of working, and suspended from it was a single silver bead. It was not a polished, store-bought trinket. It was hand-hammered, likely made from a silver coin he had melted down and shaped with patient, microscopic taps of a hammer. It was rough, textured, and beautiful in its imperfection. Clara touched it. "You made this. Silver," Tuba said. He touched the scar on his wrist where the manacles had once been. "Silver binds. Silver heals." He stepped behind her. Clara lifted her hair, her heart beating a little faster. He tied the leather thong around her neck, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. The silver bead settled in the hollow of her throat, warm from his pocket. He turned her around to face him. He placed his hands on her shoulders, looking down at her with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "You safe," Tuba said, enunciating each word with care. "With me." It was the completion of the sentence he had started in the cave, months ago. Water, safe, no harm, now. It was a statement of fact. "I know," Clara whispered. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. "I am not afraid." That night, the valley was silent. The wind chime outside offered only the occasional soft note. Inside the cabin, The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a deep orange light across the room. They had eaten in a comfortable silence. Now, Clara sat on the edge of the bed Tuba had built from oak, solid and unmoving. Tuba stood by the fireplace, banking the coals for the night. Clara watched the play of muscle in his back. For months, they had lived with a line drawn between them, a line of respect, of trauma, of propriety. He had promised to be her patient guardian. He had kept that vow through the violence of the canyon, the cold of the winter, and the judgment of the fort. But the war was over. The winter was gone. "Tuba," Clara said. He turned. He saw her sitting there, her hair unpinned and falling over her shoulders, the silver bead gleaming at her throat. He saw the look in her eyes. It was not the look of a teacher instructing a student. It was the look of a woman calling to her husband. "You said you would be patient forever," Clara said softly. Tuba nodded slowly. "Forever." Clara stood up. She walked across the rough wooden floor until she stood before him. She could smell the scent that was uniquely his wood smoke, cured leather, and the clean, sharp smell of the wind. "You do not have to wait any more," she whispered. She reached out and undid the top button of his shirt. Tuba froze for a second, his breath hitching. He looked at her face, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the old fear. He found none. He found only trust, a trust so absolute it terrified him more than any gun. He raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and touched her cheek. His skin was rough, scarred from a lifetime of survival, but his touch was lighter than a feather. It was a reverence. "Clara," he breathed. It was a prayer. When he kissed her, it was not the crashing violence of a storm. It was the slow, inevitable rising of the tide. It was the meeting of two people who had been hollowed out by the world and had filled each other up again. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the bed as if she were made of glass, yet holding her as if she were the only solid thing in the universe. There was no rush. There was the rough texture of his hands against her skin, the warmth of his breath, the weight of his body shielding her from the vast emptiness of the plains. In the darkness of the cabin, stripped of their histories and their scars, they were not a white woman and a Comanche warrior. They were just a man and a woman, finding a language that required no words, claiming a joy that the world had tried to deny them. The seasons turned, as they always did. Summer brought the heat, but also the harvest. The homestead at Free Spring became a landmark. It wasn't a town, and it wasn't a ranch in the traditional sense. It was a hub. Mateo had returned, bringing with him a dozen head of cattle and 2 other vaqueros who were tired of the cruelty of the trail bosses. They built a bunkhouse near the creek, their laughter and guitar music drifting on the evening air. One Sunday in July, a buggy rattled down the canyon road. It was Judge Amos Halley, looking older but still sharp-eyed, accompanied by a circuit preacher who looked like he had swallowed a lemon. "Just passing through on the way to Santa Fe," the judge claimed, climbing down with a groan. "Though I heard the water here is the best in the territory." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. "The water is free. Judge, the coffee will cost you a story." They sat on the porch. The preacher seemed nervous, eyeing Tuba, who was sharpening a scythe by the barn. But when Tuba approached, offering a ladle of cool water with a nod of respect, the tension broke. "We have no church here," Clara told them. "But we have a Bible, and we have peace." The preacher, perhaps realizing that God was found in more places than just buildings with steeples, offered a simple blessing over their house. He prayed for the crops, for the cattle, and for the union of these 2 souls. It was a small thing, but as the Amen drifted up toward the mesa, Clara felt the final brick of their legitimacy slide into place. But the true definition of their home came a month later. A familiar canvas-topped wagon creaked into the yard. It was the family they had helped the previous autumn, the couple whose baby had been born in the cabin. The baby, Samuel, was now a chubby, bright-eyed infant, sitting on his mother's lap. "We were heading back east," the husband explained, looking sheepish. Arizona didn't work out. Too dry. We wondered if you needed hands. I can work wood. My wife, she can sew. Clara looked at Tuba. They didn't need hands. They had Mateo and the vaqueros. They were managing. Tuba looked at the baby. He walked over and held out a finger. The infant grabbed it, his tiny, pale hand wrapping around Tuba's dark, scarred finger with a grip of surprising strength. Tuba looked at the mother. He walks soon. Any day now. The woman smiled tiredly. Tuba looked at Clara. He didn't need to speak. She saw it in his eyes. He was remembering his own daughter, the one the soldiers had taken. He could not bring her back, but he could ensure that this child, this Samuel, had a place to walk where the ground was safe. We have timber, Tuba said to the man. We build another room. Clara felt a lump in her throat. This was the twist she hadn't expected. She had thought family was something you were born into, or perhaps something you married into. But out here, in the shadow of the Cap Rock, family was something you gathered. It was the people who stopped, the people who stayed, the people who broke bread and shared the water. They were an island of misfits, a disgraced schoolteacher, a silenced warrior, a rebellious vaquero, and a failed settler family. And yet, together, they were stronger than Silas Trent had ever been with all his money and hired guns. Late that afternoon, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and gold, Clara and Tuba walked down to the edge of the spring. This was where it had started. The water bubbled up from the limestone, clear and cold, just as it had for 1,000 years. It didn't care about deeds or affidavits. It simply gave life. Clara stood beside Tuba, her shoulder brushing his arm. She wore the silver bead at her throat. She looked at her reflection in the water, a woman who had found her strength not by hardening her heart, but by opening it. I used to think, Clara said quietly, that the West was a place where you went to get lost, where people disappeared. Tuba watched the water. Some disappear, he agreed. But we didn't, Clara said. We were found. She looked back at the cabin. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Mateo was laughing with the settler husband near the barn. The baby was crying, a sound that was quickly hushed by a mother's song. It was messy, it was loud, and it was imperfect. It is not the life I imagined when I left Missouri, Clara admitted. It is harder, it is dustier. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce with love. And I would not trade a single minute of it. Tuba turned to face her. The wind caught his long black hair. He looked at the woman who had stood between him and a mob, the woman who had washed his wounds, the woman who had taught him that his voice still had power. He looked at the land around them. He saw the fence lines that did not shut people out, but invited them in. He saw the justice that had come late, but had arrived nonetheless. True freedom, he realized, was not roaming the plains without a tether. True freedom was being known, completely and without judgment, and choosing to stay. He reached out and took Clara's hand. He squeezed it, feeling the pulse of her life against his palm. He looked at the cabin, then back to her. He spoke one word. It was round, clear, and heavy with meaning. It was a seal on their past and a promise for their future. Home! Clara smiled, and the tears that finally fell were not from grief, but from a gratitude too vast to name. Yes, she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder as the first star appeared in the twilight sky. Home. The West did not promise peace. It promised storms, and drought, and hard ground, but it also promised the truth. And as Clara stood there, holding the hand of the warrior who had become her heart, she knew that as long as they stood in the truth, the future was bright enough to burn away any shadow. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and the redemption of the Texas frontier, and I hope Clara and Tuba's story touched something in you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you tuning in from a busy city, a quiet countryside, or somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the ending. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really want to help these stories reach more people, please hit that hype button. Your support means the world and helps keep the spirit of the West alive. Thank you, and happy trails until the next story.